This is Debbie Lynn Toomey, Tufts Medical Center Injury Prevention Coordinator, and welcome to Aging Strong. It's the outreach and injury prevention program that's meant to share information and resources that empowers older adults. And today's guest is Joe Reardon from Cohane Funeral Home in Quincy. Did you know, before I have you talk, Joe, did you know that about 36 Americans have talked with or written parts of their funeral plans with their family, according to the 2021 survey by the National Funeral Directors Association? So while it may sound kind of morbid to be planning for your funeral, a lot of people are becoming more proactive. It's a nice, loving way, in a way, to take care of the loved ones, friends and families who are left behind. So Joe is going to talk about advanced funeral planning. And I can't wait to learn about what that entails and steps that we can start taking so that hopefully when the day comes, a loved one or a friend passes away, we are more prepared and less burdened by all the other overwhelming things that we have to think about to help them to send them off. So Joe, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Tufts Medical Center and this particular program, which is so great. One of the things that we found as funeral directors is that oftentimes an individual who does sustain a fall has a rapid decline, needs additional services, sometimes even long-term care. And it's often in those situations that families may choose to call us as they prepare, not necessarily for an imminent death, but more of the planning necessary to ensure that they can access the healthcare benefits that they need, of which advanced funeral planning, as we'll discuss, is a part. But what I will tell you is that of the 36%, you did your research, that's very good, the 36% of people who have done that, it's interesting to note that they say what they want, which is important. However, what I remind people is that what I want when I die is not going to affect me. Now, this never was a problem because people, good or bad, tended to have the same type of arrangements for years and years and years. That's changed, which is good because of all the options that are currently available to families. However, some people just aren't aware of those options and will tell their families, this is what I want, to be sure that they get what they want, but also doing so in a manner that is in their mind going to benefit their family. Oftentimes, don't pay any attention to me, just cremate me and throw me away. And most of that is language, just self-deprecation as a parent in particular, but as a spouse and others, people say that all the time. Unfortunately, when a family comes in and a mom or dad has done that, despite our opportunities to speak with them, or they come in and say, this is what mom told me she wanted, and we're going to do that without having a conversation, that can cause problems for the family. And there's a lot of resentment that can happen, and they don't have the opportunity to embrace the experience as a way to go through and kick off, if you will, an awful period of loss and grief. The period of loss and grief is sustained over time, but having a ritual, having support of family and friends allows people to be bolstered as they approach that. So it's really an opportunity to discuss advanced funeral planning today that will allow, I hope, many families, particularly the people who are watching, to be able to sit down with their family members and say, hey, this is perhaps what I want. What do you think? How will it affect you? One of the great things about advanced funeral planning is, of course, you have plenty of time to do it. So today, what I'd like to do is walk through the process, identify some benefits of advanced funeral planning, as well as speak to the financial impact of it. Many people have questions about advanced funeral planning. One of the first questions and most often questions we hear is, where does the money go? And we'll talk all about that, how your money's safe and how your arrangements are safe as we go through the process. So if it's all right, Debbie, may I share the screen?
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
And Debbie, for those who may be live with us, is there an opportunity to ask questions through the chat?
Yes, definitely. For those who are live with us, either unmute yourself ask the question, and then, or if you just want to type in your question, please do so, put it in the chat.
We have been proactively working with families to encourage advanced planning for years. I'd say over 30 years or more, proactively. And this has been done through seminars, through being out in the community. Ed Cohane was ahead of the curve when he approached this topic, having his own experiences as a funeral director and with family members, to recognize that if you have some things prepared in advance, it will make things so much better at the time. I'll share a personal story about that as we go through today. The 4 topics we're divided this into are the benefits of advanced planning, the process itself, payment methods, and then funding methods. Where does the money go? We'll dig a little bit deeper into the payment and funding methods when we speak to benefit eligibility, because we want families to know how that works. Advanced funeral planning provides the peace of mind of knowing that one's affairs are in order. The vast majority of people who come to work with us say, hey, I don't want my kids to have to worry about it. I want this to be done. I want to put it in a drawer, tell my family where it is, and not have to worry that they will have to encounter a burden when the time comes. The whole idea behind it is to be able to just make that phone call for a funeral director to respond and care for a person and for their family, allowing them to speak to the opportunity that is the experience of the funeral. The experience is what makes a funeral. People don't remember what color a casket is necessarily, or an urn. It's the experience. And having one's affairs and orders allows that opportunity to be taken advantage of, and ultimately helps the entire family. In line with that is the fact that advanced funeral planning helps address social, psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs of family and friends at a difficult time. The whole opportunity to create that personal and meaningful experience feeds a person's social, psychological, emotional, and spiritual health. And I would argue even physical health, because so many people have gone through this process with a tremendous amount of stress. The stress can be debilitating. When they have everything in order, it's less stressful, and they can get the support from the people who are coming to visit with them, or to drop a casserole at the house, or make a phone call just to check in, and you have the time to take advantage of all that. And that kind of feeds our soul, which in turn will feed us physically and allow us to heal in that way as well. And then another benefit, and this is one we hear often, is that this allows for resources to be set aside to relieve the family of a financial burden. So rather than expecting or relying on our own families to do something, many people choose to set aside the financial arrangements to ensure that their funeral is carried out in an appropriate way without burdening their children. That also plays into some of the other benefits, which we'll discuss. First and foremost, it's something we hear a lot. We hear lots of pieces about people going into nursing homes. There are ads on TV. There are various elder law firms and Medicaid specialists who advise family that the funeral funds are irrevocably assigned and can't be touched. Now, that's an optional piece, because you can set up a contract with the funeral director that's revocable, where you could take your money out and go to the casino tomorrow if that's what you wanted. But if it's irrevocably assigned, that money's protected and may only be used for the purposes of paying for funeral expenses. That is often used, as many people have heard the term spend down, a spend down choice to qualify for mass health like long-term care or SSI, whatever benefits may be available to families. So it's a huge part of that. I would argue that having these arrangements done and the money protected is a huge benefit, but having the opportunity to get the benefit of the experience on the long term is actually a far better one. Another piece that this involves is speaking to families about any sort of legal or practical issues that could come up. Now, one of the biggest issues we've encountered is with regard to cremation. if an individual wants to be cremated and their spouse doesn't want them to be cremated, that spouse has every right to say no. Of course, I'm making this up, but things like this happen because a lot of times there's a conversation, but nothing's ever done about it. The conversation ends at this is what I want, and there's no further discussion of how that would impact the other person. For example, I had a family, the gentleman wanted to be cremated and scattered in Texas on a beach where he was serving when he was in the Navy. Sounds great, very romantic, but it was a huge burden for his family, but they never discussed it. So to my knowledge, that gentleman presently is in the care of his family and he's never been scattered. So that can be an issue which could have been resolved in advance with a conversation or some logistics to allow us to help them perhaps go through that process. Another issue is with regard to cemetery space. Cemetery space is something that people often will ask to be buried with a grandparent or with an aunt and uncle or a parent, and find that their rights to be buried there are the same as all their siblings and all their cousins. Well, if that's addressed in advance, the authorizations for that can be set aside and in place. You can even get a reservation of coming attractions at cemeteries so that people will know that this spot is reserved for a particular person. Identifying those issues in advance makes things a lot easier. So when the time comes, everybody knows they'll be signing off on cremation, for example, whether that's a spouse or children or whomever. Everyone has an understanding of the practical issues with regard to scattering and things like that. And also, when you're looking at burial space or space in a columbarium, is the person eligible to be buried there, and have those authorizations been made? Just to make sure that it's all done. Otherwise, at the time of death, it can be very traumatic to have to try and figure everything out and go and get 10 signatures in order to bury someone with her mom. So getting it done in advance will help. And it also helps, as you see, with family relationships. The conversation alone is helpful. It minimizes any of the conflicts that I've spoken about. And again, funerals don't affect the person who has died. It affects those who are left behind. By setting all of the arrangements up with your family's consultation, everybody has an opportunity to take advantage of that experience and also protect themselves financially and otherwise. So the benefits are amazing. I like to share the story of my own mother-in-law. My father and father-in-law died a week apart. It was an awful difficult time with no planning. When my mother-in-law got older, I was suggesting that she do her advanced planning, and she was reluctant to do it. However, she had some physical and cognitive issues that created a situation where she needed additional services in her home. When we applied for that, we were told that she has too much money, you'd need to spend down, so we prepaid her funeral. We also planned the entire funeral at the time, and she lived for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years after that. So when she went through the process and got the benefits for her home health aides and other assistance, and then ultimately ended up in a long-term care facility, we knew that that money was safe for her funeral expenses. But when she died, it made all the difference in the world to know that all I had to do as a funeral director was call my office, and my colleague, Greg Byron, answered the phone and looked everything up and said, "Joe, it looks like you're going to have a wake. You're going to have a mass at St. Agatha Church, and you're going to bury Janet at Blue Hill Cemetery." Yep. He's like, "I'll be right there." And he just transferred her from the nursing home where we were with her to the funeral home. And Janine and I, my wife, and our 2 children, my wife's an only child, so it was just us, had the opportunity to really dive into the personal and meaningful aspects of the ceremonies, which after the ceremonies, people remarked about. And we wouldn't have been able to do it that way had we not had the time. Because the process itself, the advanced planning process, is a little bit time consuming and can leave room for questions that are better answered over time than they are in a situation where you have to make it instantaneously. So one piece of that is gathering vital statistics information. When a person dies, obviously a death certificate needs to be filed, a legal document. That legal document is the key to benefits or to asset liquidation or things like that. So it's important that it's done correctly. Some of the information on it includes a person's social security number, their parents' names, the deceased parents' names, and their birthplaces. And sometimes, particularly for children, that can be information that they don't have readily available. By having it in advance, all of that together. In addition, for those who have served our country in the military, a copy of their discharge papers, a form known as a DD-214, is necessary. That information is filed with the death certificate. In addition, that particular form is one that is used to access benefits like military honors, to ensure there's a flag for the person. Without that DD-214, we can't do that. And sometimes they're hard to find. So having this information gathered in one place in advance is helpful. The next part of the process will be choosing a method of disposition. So burial is a method of both immediate and final disposition. You'll find that on death certificates, the disposition is listed as immediate form of disposition. Cremation is an immediate form, but not a final form of disposition, because after a person's been cremated, they have to go somewhere. This is an important consideration as it leads into your ceremony options, as it leads into final disposition options. When a person is cremated, we speak to the family about, okay, where's your mom going to go afterward? And sometimes people say, well, I'm going to take her home, which is absolutely something people can do. What we encourage people to consider, however, is to remember that you may want a place to go where other people can go. So if I go and visit my father in the cemetery, I can go anytime the cemetery is open. If I go to visit my father at my brother's house, that's a little bit different. Most people, 67% of people who choose cremation, want permanent memorialization. So that discussion about burial, cremation, and ultimately final disposition choices is really important to have. And sometimes it's one where, if it's not discussed in advance, can cause a lot of confusion. So having that put together can lead into the opportunities that you have with goods and services that need to be selected. For example, most people who choose cremation have open casket ceremonies and then cremation following that. But some people choose to have cremation first. Well, there are different pieces to all of that. Your decisions as a family or as an individual, hopefully with the family's consultation, will make it so that we will be able to assist you in walking through what you need and what you don't need to ensure that everything is comfortable for you. And once all those selections are made, we'd want to establish the financial arrangements. And that's probably the question we get most, because it's one of the, I don't know of another industry in the world that's a service industry where you can prepay for something today and have no need to pay anything additional 10 years from now. It's very unique, and it causes questions around where the money is, how it's protected, and things like that, which we're going to explore. When people choose to prepay their funeral expenses, the most important part is finding a contract with some sort of payment and trying to ensure that the financial resources are set aside so that children don't have to pay for it at the time of need, or whomever, nieces, nephews. Most people will make a single payment of all expenses. They know this is part of what they need to do to prepare for their end of life concerns. You know, they're going to do their will, their power of attorney. They're going to try and protect their home and set things up so that their children will receive whatever is going to be passed along to them. This should be a part of it. So most people do it this way to ensure that it is taken care of as well. However, we have lots of different options. Some people choose monthly payment plans. We have fixed monthly payment plans where people can get a price guarantee with an early payoff option, so that if they pay for it in a year, as an example, it's the same as cash, whether we went up in price or not. So there are some options there. Another great option is a flexible payment plan. These are payments that can be made at the discretion of the buyer. Situations where an individual has some money that they want to start paying towards their funeral expenses. And we saw this in 2020 with some of the stimulus funds, people would call us because either A, it put them over their limit for benefits, or B, they said, well, this is a good opportunity to do something so my family won't have to worry about it. Families can make all the selections, they can bind the contract with a deposit, and then they can pay for it at their own pace. The price guarantee is only available when it is fully paid. However, as I say to families all the time, if you want to protect your children financially, and that's your goal, anything that you put towards it is going to help them and lessen their burden. And the other piece, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, but families can assign existing insurance. So if someone has a policy from MetLife and that policy was intended to pay for funeral expenses, you can do an assignment. And some of these assignments, absolute assignments, as change of ownerships and beneficiary, are accepted by Mass Health to ensure that it's not counted as an asset. But this can be done in advance of the time of need. After the time of need, someone could have 10 beneficiaries of a particular policy, and the funeral home would have no access to those funds. So it's important to consider that as an option as well, because that's something that doesn't take anything out of your pocket at the time. There's no cost protection because we can't control these policies and didn't advise the family to purchase them. But at the same time, it's something that can go towards the expenses and can protect the asset as individuals seek benefits. The big question, where does the money go? So there's a funeral home, local funeral home that's going out of business, and we've received calls. I heard they're going out of business. Can you help us? I'm like, absolutely. A funeral home that goes out of business is required to let all of their account holders know that they are going out of business and they have the opportunity to transfer their contract. All contracts are transferable. So you could set up a contract with our funeral home and move to Florida, which we've done, and transfer it to a funeral home in Florida. It's done this way to protect the consumer because the money does not go into our accounts. It's not on our books. It's held in either a traditional bank trust, where there's an account in the consumer's name, and the flexible payment plan is oftentimes why we'd use a traditional bank trust, because you can make deposits at any time, but still transferable. The other option for payment for people who wish to fund their arrangements is the use of a pre-need insurance contract. It's not a contract as we would consider an insurance contract being monthly premiums and things like that. It can be, but more often it is a single payment. It is designed for pre-need. So you can't buy a $500,000 policy. There's a limit, a small limit on what they can fund. So this particular product typically works best with a single payment. It is tax-free, it grows tax-free, unlike a bank trust where you would get reporting for the IRS. It's also transferable. And in some ways, it's a little bit easier to transfer these contracts because you can go directly to the company. You don't necessarily have to go through the funeral home. So both of these methods are used to protect the consumer's money. If a funeral home goes out of business, they can just transfer them. That way, people know that their money's safe. They have no concerns. Even if a funeral home is acquired by another funeral home, they have to send that letter. So it's anytime there's a change of ownership or a cease of ownership that they have to send this out. So it's very well regulated. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we had the state inspectors here for their check-in. They do so every couple of years, and they actually pull folders and look at them, make sure that the funding is there and that the documents have been executed properly. So it's very heavily regulated, which is a good thing. We have been doing this for a long, long time and have every trust in the world with the companies that we work with, and know that our family's monies are going to be there when the time comes. When families are looking at doing advanced planning, we're happy to sit down with the individuals whenever they want. What I always suggest that they do, however, is not come alone, that they bring someone with them. Sometimes we'll have situations where a spouse will come and say, I don't want to tell my husband I'm here. Like, well, that's something you should probably talk about. We can provide information and get the process started, but it's so important to speak with family and friends about your wishes, because the wishes aren't going to affect us when the time comes. It will affect everybody else. Gather and record basic information. That vital statistics information is important. When someone sits down with a funeral director, they will need to provide those specific pieces of information we discussed. So parents' names and birthplaces, social security number, occupation, all those types of things. And to have it recorded in advance would be helpful. And then to perhaps record some of your wishes, have things in line, have something specific in mind when you come back to speak with a funeral director, because we can provide you with information, but it's up to you to decide what's best for you and your family. We encourage families to research and select a funeral service provider. Now, obviously, we have every confidence in our ability to care for families, but it's a different type of industry where people don't always explore their options. And not having known if that funeral home has been acquired by somebody else, not having known if that funeral home's been updated in 10 years, not knowing any of the staff there, people will still go to a funeral home because that's what we always did, which, to be fair, we do benefit from in some ways, but we encourage families to explore because there are differences. And at the time of a death, we want to be sure that we are in our most comfortable situation possible, because we're going to be dealing with these people for a certain amount of time, in their facilities for a certain amount of time. And even if we're not in their facilities and choose something that doesn't include any sort of ceremony at the funeral home, the way a funeral home is maintained can be indicative of the way they care for the person who has died. So it's important to get that feel to make sure that everybody's comfortable. And lastly, having all this together, sit and work with a provider and with family members to create a truly meaningful tribute. It will honor your life, but it's really there for your family, to comfort them and to make sure that they get that boost and are bolstered as they go through the grieving process. Oftentimes we have plenty of questions, and I don't know, Debbie, if you have some people who put into the chat or may have questions. I'm happy to answer any that people may have.
Oh, thank you, Joe. There's nothing on the chat so far, but if you can come off share screen,
Sure.
so we can see each other better. And for those of you who want to ask any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, because Joe covered so many really wonderful information. I do have some questions for you, Joe.
Sure, please.
And everybody, please don't be shy. So the concept of advanced funeral planning, I never really, just until I invited you to come on this program, and never really thought much about how important it is to do this. But how soon is it? How soon is too soon to be planning for one's funeral?
I would say it's never too soon to plan, to have a sense of what will happen and how it will affect your family. Many of us who have children, Debbie, I know you have children approximately my children's age, and you're paying tuitions or you're doing different things or what have you. And so from a financial perspective, it would be hard to maybe come up with that money now. And given the fact that we are living longer lives, not necessarily healthier, but longer lives, maybe that's something that you could, because people are working, they typically have a benefit through their insurance and can rely on an insurance benefit from work to pay for the funeral expenses. But at least having a discussion about it would be helpful. I often say to families when they ask questions about, well, why would I do this? Or this is morbid. And I said, well, it's really not. I said, well, why? It's like, because it's going to happen. What do you mean? So, well, I'll ask them straight up, do you have homeowners insurance or renters insurance? Oh, of course I do. I have to. It's okay. How many times has your house burned down? It's never burned down. You are going to die. So because we live in a culture that is so death averse, that looks at death as a failure, we don't discuss these things. But having everything in place with the conversation ahead of time makes all the difference in the world. My advanced planning is done. Everything is all set. Janine and I bought our graves when we were 30. Granted, we both had personal experiences and professional experience that taught us we need to do this ahead of time. But for a lot of people, it's something that they just put on the back burner. And sometimes it's not even on a burner, it's sitting cold on the side. So having that conversation when I was 30, when we got our grave, so even that young is helpful. And as we get older, it becomes more important. And as we start to look at our estate planning around retirement time, when we're downsizing and doing things like that, that's probably the optimal time to consider it. Most of the people I work with are between 65 and 75 who are finalizing their advanced planning, but some of them come to me with everything having been talked out and ready to go because they did it years ago. So there's no inappropriate time to do it, but I'd say the sweet spot in doing it from a financial perspective and a legal perspective is probably 65 to 75.
Okay, good to know. We do have a question from the chat. How much are the average funeral expenses?
It depends. So cremation and burial vary, ceremony options vary. It used to be that you could say it was X dollars. Now it's not. So a family having full service ceremonies with casket burial is going to be more expensive than families choosing cremation first or not having ceremonies or just a graveside ceremony. So it could range anywhere from, a few $1,000s up to, if you include cemetery expenses, to purchase graves can be expensive. You could be talking, inclusive of all that, you could be talking high teens. But the funeral home itself, what we actually provide is typically not in that range. I think the national average, I think they might have it at $10,000 or something now, but that was a good fact years ago, but now it's up and down and all over the place. So I'd rather give a range and say it could be anywhere from $4,000 to, upwards $20,000. It could be whatever a family wants to do. And everybody has different choices. Everybody has different needs and everybody has different financial status. So it can vary greatly. But I'd be happy to provide people specific information if they want. I can detail it based upon what they feel they would like to have for ceremonies and disposition and get a more exact figure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was at a funeral last Friday and had been going to a few funerals a lot more lately. And as you know, Joe, as we get older, the people in our lives who are older than us, pretty soon we start, gathering in that type of space. And it's remarkable how different tributes are special in their own way. Mm-hmm. And if I'm wondering, because of the funerals I've attended recently, there seems to be a lot more decisions towards cremation. Do you find that to be happening more and more? People are deciding Absolutely. To go on in that direction?
Yep. And it's a good and bad thing. So in 2016, the United States, for the first time, had a disposition rate for cremation higher than casket burial. And it hasn't gone down. It's continuing to rise. It is rising for a couple of different reasons. One of the chief reasons is that people think it may be less expensive. Another reason is that it is permissible now, particularly in an area like Boston, where there's a significantly strong, or used to be, Catholic influence, that even people who don't go to church still think that they can't be cremated. And that's changed. More and more people aware of that. The fact that people don't go to church anymore, you'll find that, I think the number that Pew came out with in 2021 was that 47% of the American population wants to identify themselves as belonging to a faith community. That was 70% in 1999. So when you look at those numbers, you can see people drifting away from the rituals that they had before, see them drifting away from any sort of rules that perhaps they adhered to before, because in some cultures, if you take observant Muslims and Jewish families or Orthodox Christian families, they absolutely will not have cremation. But yet there are so many people who aren't part of those groups anymore. The Catholic Church has allowed cremation since 1963, that you're finding more people choosing it that way. An interesting part of it, though, is people will also choose cremation for themselves. So I have a lot of families that come to me. and they'll say, "Oh, I'm going to be cremated," and I said, "Oh, okay." And for your wife, well, whatever she wants. I said, "Well, what would you do?" Well, whatever she wants. And finally, it just have to be hard. Like, if God forbid something happened today, what would you do? Oh, I'd have a wake and I'd have a service, and then I'd have her cremated and buried. I said, so you'd have all that for her, but not for you. Yeah, no, not for me. And I've been honest with people, like, that's kind of selfish, and they're taken aback. But I remind them, remember, it's not for you, it's for the people who are left behind. And I think people look at cremation as an opportunity to minimize the ceremony and perhaps allow families to escape an emotional burden, when in fact it causes more of a burden, because there are so many different options with cremation. And also, choosing a final disposition method is something that right now has caused 1 out of 5 homes in the United States to have a person who's been cremated in the home. They don't know what to do with them. They haven't thought it through. The person said, "Oh, just take me home afterward." But unfortunately, what will happen if the person is not scattered, or they don't use keepsake options, or not buried or placed in a columbarium niche, is that at some point the great-grandchildren are going to have like 10 people on their mantle and not know what to do with them. So cremation's awesome because it provides so many different options and opportunities. But because there are so many, it can be very difficult, and it can be very burdensome for the family to discern all those options, particularly after a death has occurred. In advance, it makes it a lot easier because there are legal and practical issues about, say, and we get a lot of this from families. My mom's at St. Joseph Cemetery in West Roxbury. They were originally from South Boston, and they're all buried over there. Can I go there? You may be able to in an urn. Like, really? They just don't know. So those types of things, if we address it in advance, not only can they have what they want, but we can ensure that it's facilitated properly and there aren't any legal issues about a sister or brother saying, "No, I want to go there," and then having a problem identifying who will be buried there. So I think it's important to consider all those things, but it's a lot. It's a lot of information, but it's great opportunities for memorialization and personalization that you don't often get with casket burial.
Well, I mean, when you talked about this position, the final place where the urn would be, well, my mom is, she says, "I don't want to burden you girls. There's me and my 3 sisters and, our families.
Sure.
I don't want to burden you girls. I don't want to wake. I just want a funeral, a nice Catholic funeral, and then take my ashes and just kind of sprinkle it in the ocean."
Right.
How realistic is that, sprinkling the ashes in the ocean? Do I need to get any permission to do that, or how does that work?
Well, that's part of the issue, is that because particularly you identify your family as Catholic, we don't have a lot of experience as a Catholic in, say this, in cremation. I mean, I do because I'm a funeral director, but most of us don't. No one in my family's been cremated, or no one had been cremated until my uncle during the pandemic. So we just don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. With scattering at sea, there are rules that as a licensed funeral establishment, as a licensed funeral director, I would have to abide by, as would my colleagues. The person is to be scattered 3 miles from shore, and they should have a permit from the EPA in order to do it. And that is supposed to be sent back after the scattering has taken place. But there are a lot of people who don't follow those rules. So that is ultimately up to them. But 2 pieces to comment on the situation. Your mom doesn't want people paying attention to her. She doesn't want a fuss made over her, right? But her decision could impact your family where, well, geez, Mom, we want to see you and say goodbye to you. We want our friends to come and support us, because visitation, which we've been doing for so long. And if you think back historically, when somebody died, people just showed up. They showed up to support. It's human instinct to want to do that. And when we don't have that opportunity, we lose that support, because say someone just has something in the morning, well, how many people are going to be able to take time off from work to be able to come and support you, as opposed to after work, they could come by and say hello. So there's trade-offs there, but it's uniquely American. And it's funny to see other cultures as they approach death rituals compared to the United States, because it's almost nihilistic in the way that people approach it. But underlying all of that is this feeling of, I'm helping you by lessening your burden, which is exactly what your mom has in her mind, I'm sure. I don't want you girls to have to go through this. I don't want you to have to cry. I don't want you to have a party when I die. At the end of the day, no one has a party because somebody died. It's not like winning the World Series. You don't have a party because somebody died.
Exactly.
You need support. You need to gather. You have to be sad. It's a function of it. That's how we get through life, to be able to go through those emotions. And if we don't, we could have issues down the road. But it's well-intentioned, yet people, I don't think, see the impact of it until it's turned around and say, well, if you do that for yourself, what would you do for your spouse? Oh, would I do something entirely different usually? So it's just a unique piece to it. But back to the scattering at sea, there are rules. There's rules about scattering from the air. You can, from like an airplane or a hot air balloon even. There are rules about scattering in freshwater, rules about scattering in like public places. You can't do it at Walt Disney World or Fenway Park or any of those places. It's about permission. It's about the environment. So there are different rules. And we provide families with all that information here, so they're aware of it. We have a presentation that includes all of that, so they know exactly what they can or can't do based on the law.
Good to know. Good to know. Now I'll know what to say to my mom.
Well, most importantly, Debbie, where is she going to go after she's cremated?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's that next step. And many, many people, because we don't care what happens to our bodies when we die. That's just my body. I don't care. But like, I care about my mother and you care about your mother. And so let's have a plan together.
Exactly. All right. So we do have another question, a good question from Maureen. What are the options for cremation?
Oof. May I ask options with regard to ceremony or final disposition, or both? I don't know if Maureen
can you do both? Can you answer both?
Sure. Let me start with final disposition, only because we've been discussing that. And the fact that, your mom said, just cremate me. And then there was like a hard stop after that and not what happens afterwards. I like to share the story of my friend who lost her dad. And she called me up and said, "Oh, we lost dad. Oh, I'm awful sorry. What have you been thinking of?" And she said, "Well, he always wanted to be cremated." I said, "That's great." I said, "Number one, where's he going to go after he's cremated?" "Oh, I don't know." "Okay. What type of ceremonies are you having?" "Well, he didn't want to have a wake." I said, "Well, that has nothing to do with cremation." "It doesn't?" "Nope." "So what do you think?" "Oh, I don't know." Then finally, we were able to set things up, and it sounded like what your mom was talking about, Debbie. It was going to be a funeral mass with him present in an urn. But we still had to address where he was going afterwards. And the thought was we'd take him home. And he said, "Okay, well, you take dad home, and then your mom dies and you take her home. And then you and your husband and your, brother and sister all die and take them home. What are your kids going to do with them?" "I don't know." Unfortunately, we don't consider that part of it. And what I can tell you is that the grandchildren aren't going to put mom and dad and Nana and Grampy in the dumpster. It's just not going to happen. But what they are going to do is not know what to do. And so that's a huge part of it. And there are a bunch of different options. 67% of people who choose cremation want a permanent memorialization. They want a place to go. Locally, we have obviously in-ground burial space, and we have above ground burial space. One of the largest misconceptions about burial space is that there isn't enough and we're running out. And that's just not true. If everyone in the United States died today, they could be buried in the land the size of Rhode Island. But it's one of those urban myths that just keeps regenerating. One of the definite reasons that is going to be the case for a long time is that families are choosing cremation. So you're using graves again that you never thought you would. Many cemeteries will offer the opportunity for 1 or 2 casket burials plus 2 urns in the same grave. So you're able to utilize that space in the family and keep people together, which is what my friend ultimately did. So that's probably the most commonly selected option would be burial of a person. Next to that would be placement in a columbarium niche, which would be an above ground structure like a mausoleum would be. So the columbarium holds people who are in urns. Typically, it's purchased for 2 people. So it'd be 2 people in urns to be placed there. That would be the second option, both of which have that opportunity to have the person's name there. This person existed, people can visit, there's a connection. Scattering is an option that people will consider because usually it's what the person asked for. And, I want to be scattered at Castle Island. We hear that a lot, which of course you can't do. You're not supposed to do. But people say things like that. And I think the 2 components with it for the person who has died and their wish is self-deprecating. Well, I want to be scattered there because I don't want people to have to go to the cemetery. I don't want to have to be, and it's nice, but sometimes it can be an issue for the family. The other part of it are people who, as a family, always went out into the woods somewhere camping, or they went up to a lake in Maine or wherever it is, and that was personal and meaningful to them. And that works really well for them as long as they obey the rules. And as far as we know, we give them the rules, and whatever happens, happens after that. The third part of disposition options would be keepsake options. So that could be, and many people have heard about this, a small portion of somebody placed in a locket that they wear around their neck, or made into jewelry. They make synthetic diamonds as an example, or they could be made into, one gentleman wanted to be made into a beer stein so his son could drink out of him. The son didn't do it when the time came. You also have something as, and this sounds a little different, but I've had families do it, taking the small portion of a person, the really fine portions of a person after they've been cremated, and mixing that in tattoo ink and getting a tattoo. So you have all these different options, and I probably missed a couple. But in addition to that, you can do all of those options. You can do all 3. You can bury most of somebody, scatter some of somebody, and keep some of somebody. And people are blown away by that. They just don't know that those options are available to them. With the ceremony options, I think there are 3 cohorts that we deal with most often. The first is families who choose to have open casket ceremonies, a service in our funeral home or a church. So you have the visitation and then the service, and then they're cremated, and then most of those families are buried, but not all. So that's kind of the most common cohort. The next group are people who choose to have cremation prior to the ceremony. So they have the same ritual, but the person's present in an urn and not a casket. The trade-off there is obviously the opportunity for people to see the person and say goodbye to them. And then the third grouping would be people who do all sorts of different things. Some of them would be like what you mentioned about your mom, just having a funeral ceremony, nothing else. Others would be a combination of visitation and a graveside service before or after cremation. Some will have a memorial service, which is different from a funeral service in that the person is not present at all. The person is not present in a casket. The person is not present in an urn. Some people just have visitation. Some people just have a graveside ceremony. So that grouping encompasses a lot of different options, but it's the third. The first would be what people are accustomed to and comfortable with open casket ceremonies. The second would be the same ritual with cremation first. And then the third would be that grouping of people who choose many different things. So there are lots of different options. And that can be the overwhelming part for families who choose not to do advanced planning and come in and all they know is they want cremation and they don't know the options. So it's a great question to ask.
Wow. Wow. So many different information to learn about.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. I was wondering, as you were talking, COVID hit, right? And so group gathering couldn't happen. And we've had some deaths in the family, and it was during COVID. And once the restrictions started to be lessened and more larger groups can gather, we had memorial services, and we were able to, have the proper tribute to for that person. for the
Mhm.
people. Did you find you were much busier after the COVID restrictions lifted because of people wanting to celebrate people's lives in that respect, or was it pretty much?
Unfortunately, Debbie, no. So when the pandemic was at its height in 2020, we served almost 80% more families in a month that we expected. I mean, it was awfully busy and awfully tragic to see all these families go through this. However, our approach to it was we're going to care for these families in any way that is going to help them through this process. So we were still having open casket ceremonies. You can only have 10 people, but we were having families come in. They had the opportunity to see the person, say goodbye to them. We had one particular service for a family in our South Weymouth location that was featured in a Catholic newspaper in the United States and one in England. Because at that time, the Archdiocese of Boston was not allowing priests to be present in the funeral home. At this particular time, you could have, I forget what they had, you could have 10 people at a time, and the priests were allowed to go to the cemetery, but not to the funeral home. So we could have 10 people at a time in the funeral home, but the priest couldn't come. It would have to be a funeral director that did the prayers. So in this particular case, this family amounted to about 30 or so in an immediate family with children and grandchildren and the like, siblings. So what we did was we set it up so that people could come in, see their grandfather, their brother, whomever, and say goodbye to him. And then they went back outside to their cars and they remained there until the time to leave for the cemetery. The immediate family, the children, were in the room and they had the opportunity to be present physically for the ceremony. Well, we took it to the nth degree, as we often do, to make sure that families get everything they want. And we adjusted it so there were actually 9 family members inside. We brought in a person to do a reading. We brought someone in to say a prayer, to do a eulogy. They'd go in and go out. All the while, we were live streaming it, so they were watching in their cars.
Wow.
That was one of the unique opportunities we had to make sure we can involve families, and it was a huge benefit because, to your question, there were families who, just out of fear, and we were all fearful of what this pandemic was going to be like as time went on, and they said, we'll do something later. The unfortunate part of it is we didn't hear from many people at all, hardly any. And a lot of those families chose cremation without any final disposition choices. We encouraged them to consider it, encouraged them to do it, but they were waiting. We're going to have something later. My experience with that has always been that the death of a person is traumatic and there's a sense of urgency to it. And when a death occurs, people respond to that trauma and to that urgency, so that people will all of a sudden will call you, they'll come by your home with food. They want to be there to support you. But over time, that wanes. The family's grief is still there, but 6 months later, other people have gone on with their lives and they may think about it, but the chances of them getting back together aren't as great. What I compare it to is that for those of us who have children, when our children were small and they had friends down the street, and they used to give them little gifts to each other at Christmas time. And then as they grew older, things got busier. Then it was between Christmas and New Year's, we'll try and get together. And then it was right after the New Year, we'll do it. And then one year, the kids are 12 or whatever. And you're like, oh, geez, we didn't get together. You go in the closet at St. Patrick's Day and those gifts are there. And they mean nothing because Christmas was 3 months ago. So it's important to consider the event. One of the first things they did after the marathon bombing was have a memorial service. Why? Because people needed to gather, they needed to support one another, and they needed to ritualize their feelings and thoughts. So important to do because as we move forward, people forget. And sometimes people don't want to let go either. So for families who have that person in their care, they may not want to let go. They may not want burial at this particular point, and that becomes hard too. So we encourage families, and we did this during the pandemic, let's do as much as we can for you now, And then we can address other things down the road. And unfortunately, very few people took us up on that.
That's too bad.
It is.
Oh, Joe, we do have another question.
Excellent.
All right. What is a green burial and what
perfect.
local cemeteries do it?
Excellent question. So we were the first funeral home in Massachusetts to be recognized by the Green Burial Council. I'll be honest with you, it's something that is not enormously popular yet. I think that could change, but right now it's not. Maybe a handful of families a year will call and ask us to care for someone with green burial. But a true green burial is one in an area that will never be built upon in any way that would disrupt the natural habitat that's there. We have been working over the years with Cedar Brook Burial Ground in Leamington, Maine. They're the closest right now, although we've been told that there are individuals exploring establishing those cemeteries in Massachusetts. None as of yet. In that particular case, and you can look them up online, they have a website. They don't utilize automotive equipment to transfer the person to the grave. The grave is hand dug. There is no outer burial container. So the person is placed directly in the ground in contact with the earth. They allow persons to be buried in shrouds. If they do have a coffin, they would have to have, and I use the term coffin because it wouldn't be a casket, because caskets are designed for open casket ceremonies and are typically not biodegradable, or easily biodegradable. Over time it will happen, but not easily biodegradable. And they prefer that it be something that's simpler. So that would be placed into the ground, directly in the ground, in either the coffin or the shroud, and they're buried by hand. The one caveat to it is that you can't have a monument. So, you can find them via GPS. You can also, they do allow you to have a small natural stone from the area there that you could place at the spot. But that would be a true green burial. There are modified green burials, and a modified green burial would allow families to come in direct contact, the deceased to come in direct contact with the earth, yet it would be in a traditional cemetery. In this area, there are 3 cemeteries that do it. There are others that would consider it, but these 3 we've worked with. One is Rockridge Cemetery in Sharon. Another is the Gardens at Gethsemane in West Roxbury. And the third is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. So each of them offers the modified green burial where the person can be placed in direct contact with the earth. There's no outer burial container. Both Rockridge and Mount Auburn do require a coffin. At the Gardens at Gethsemane, they have allowed shrouds only. But they're modified. They do use equipment to dig the graves, heavy equipment. So they're burning fossil fuels. They have monument opportunities, so you can have a monument there. So it's modified. But for some families, it's the best of both worlds. And in some cultures, Jewish families, Muslim families, they want to have that. And in some of their cemeteries, they do, in sections of cemeteries. There are a lot of Jewish cemeteries over in West Roxbury, for example. One of my colleagues was there yesterday, and they buried the person directly into the ground in their coffin. So it's similar to that, yet a green burial would be in a setting that is, if not rural, pretty close to it. It's usually in areas that are almost conservation-like. It's really nice for families who are into it. And what's interesting about it is far better for the environment than cremation. Cremation is not good for the environment. And people sometimes don't realize, not only is it the emissions, but the amount of natural gas that's used to power the retorts is enormous. And that only increases our carbon footprint, where green burial doesn't at all.
What's the one thing that you want people to come away with?
I think that we all should consider end-of-life planning. And in doing so, remember that what happens to us when we die doesn't affect us. What we do is for our families. With that in mind, many families would be better served to have conversations in advance, feel more comfortable, and be able to focus on the experience and not on selecting things.
If people have more questions, how can they get in touch with you?
So our website is Keohane.com, Keohane.com. We do have an advanced planning page on our website. I can be reached directly, very easily, Joe, Joe, @Keohane.com.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.